and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Writers Toolshed. I'm your host, Richie Billing, and today I'm delighted to welcome back our history maestro, Aidan Mattis from the Fantastic Law Lodge podcast, who's joining me to chat about the Knights of the Middle Ages and this idea of chivalry that was supposed to keep them in check. But as we know, and as you can probably guess from what we understand about human nature, it didn't. And knights were, as well as sort of walking tanks on the battlefield, they also held a lot of power and sway in society. And we discussed the evolution of how that class emerged. And we'll also be continuously referring back to writing and giving you ideas that you can use in your own stories. Before we get into that chat, just a quick reminder that if you haven't already done so, please follow or subscribe to the show. Episodes every 2 weeks, so if you don't want to miss one, that's the thing to do. If you have a few seconds to spare, please consider leaving a quick and honest rating on Spotify. I think it's only available on the mobile app for some reason, so you do have to use that to leave a rating. If you know of anyone who might like this show, or if you're in a writing group that you think may appreciate what we discuss and what we cover, please share it with them, or even just a quick share on social media. These are the best ways of supporting the show, and the bigger the audience we get, the more episodes that we can do, and the better the content it will ultimately be. And if you'd like to continue your learning beyond this episode, please do join our writing group. It's becoming a thriving community over on Discord and on Facebook. You can find lots of like-minded people, all enthusiastic and keen to learn and to improve. And one of the best ways of doing that is working together to read each other's stories and share feedback. So I can't recommend that more highly enough if you're keen to make big steps in improving your writing abilities. And we also have a Patreon page, which has an absolute horde of fantasy writing related material. I've recently just uploaded a bunch of content to do with world building. You can get access to my writing class on building fantasy worlds, plus a bunch of guides that I've recently put together. And lastly, if you are interested in sponsoring an episode of the Fantasy Writers Toolshed, please do get in touch. If you've got a new fantasy book coming out, because if anything, fantasy writers are fantasy readers as well. Or if you're a publisher looking to promote a new submission calls, or if you're a literary agency, or if you've got an editing service, get in touch. I'm always happy to help. Now it's time to crack on with the show and to look at the walking tanks that were knights of the Middle Ages. And to help me do that, I'm delighted to welcome back Aidan Mattis from the brilliant Law Lodge podcast. I'm delighted to welcome back to the show Aidan Mattis from the Fantastic Law Lodge podcast. Aidan, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, thank you. I'm having a good evening so far.
It's all going to go downhill from here.
You know it. You know how much I hate doing these. That's why I keep coming back.
Well, I'm thrilled that you've decided to come back, because I've been reading a lot of historical fiction again lately, going a big historical fiction buzz. But usually when I read historical fiction, it's about the Greeks and the Romans. Mm-hmm. And this time it's about the Middle Ages and the 100 Years' War with France. And there's a lot of talk about knighthood and chivalry. And I think that knights are almost, especially I suppose towards the end of the Middle Ages, they're sort of eponymous, aren't they, with that era? Mm-hmm. And yeah. They're so popular, like loads of people write in asking about knights and armor, weapons and stuff like that. So I thought it'd be a great topic to have a chat with you about. Knighthood then. I know it's something that developed over time. What can you tell us about it?
So knighthood as we know it today is very much a high and later Middle Ages concept, whereas the original knights were actually it was just a term for soldier, knecht. Connect, depending on which part of Germany you're from. But the term itself basically just was a term for a professional soldier. And then over time, as warfare changed and as civilization redeveloped after the fall of Rome, it moved over into something more akin to what we recognize on TV. The early medieval knights as we know them, and a lot of the time when people think early medieval, they're actually thinking 900s and the 10th century. That's not early medieval. That's the middle of the period. Getting into the high Middle Ages. Early medieval, you're looking at like 500, 600 AD, because medieval, of course, just is a term that means between. The medieval period is the period between the early modern period and the Roman imperial period. And so they would not have referred to themselves as medieval at all. What they would have been, was just you didn't even have nationalism yet, people didn't think of themselves in terms of, all right, well, I'm Aidan and I'm from Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania's in the United States, so I'm a Pennsylvanian American. Obviously nobody in the Middle Ages would think like that because Pennsylvania didn't exist. But, you're from what, Liverpool?
Yeah.
Yeah, so, for you, if somebody asked where you were from, you wouldn't say England. You would say Liverpool. You might even get more specific than that, because back then the cities were a hell of a lot smaller. So if you lived in a hamlet, 10 miles outside of the city, if somebody asked where you were from, you were going to say such and such hamlet. That's why people didn't even really have surnames at the time. People had epithets more than they had anything, because that wasn't, John Wellesley. That was John from Hampshire or something like that. So the reason that all of these things develop, like the feudal hierarchy, is the feudal system itself, because you have a very, very difficult period of time directly following the fall of the Roman Empire where everything is chaos. And the main order, the main manner in which wars were fought was that you would have a well-known or a wealthy or a powerful person who would gather a comitatus, which for the American listeners, you would probably associate this most readily with posses from the Old West. Yeah. Cowboys getting together to go and deliver some vigilante justice, or to join a local militia, something like that. And they would be under the command of some sort of leader. Very much depended on location, what that leader was called. Sometimes it would be, a jarl. Sometimes it would be a baron. It didn't really matter. Just depended on where you were. But the point was, you'd have a singular person who would lead 20 to 50 men, who would then be their household guard. And that's kind of how warfare was fought immediately after the Roman period. Of course, comitatus comes from Latin, and it is a term that generally kind of means group of men. So the early knights were those professional members of the comitatus. You had your captain, your leader, and then everybody else in the group was another professional warrior. Those were your knights. It just meant that your job was to be a soldier. And then as the feudal system develops, as we're no longer in the migratory period, you get out of the 600s and you're starting to see the formation of kingdoms that we will today recognize. You're starting to see, obviously, England itself won't be for another 300 years. France itself won't be for another 200 years. But you start to see that conglomeration, that coalescing of not nationalism yet, but at the very least, you're starting to recognize, all right, well, I am a member of this kingdom, not necessarily this nation, but you were a part of something more. And the reason for that was that you were looking at an economy that was moving from looting the spoils of Rome and fighting your neighbors back into industrial agriculturalism, into large-scale agriculture and craftsmen and trade guilds. Stuff like that around the 800s starts to regain status in society. You're no longer in those what are quickly we're very quickly abandoning the term Dark Ages. Yeah. But those Dark Ages, 476 to like 779, if you're going by Charlemagne, which is kind of how we do it. Charlemagne's kind of the beginning of the rise of medieval Europe. Before that, it's this chaotic time where kingdoms are rising and falling each generation, and trade is completely disrupted constantly, and you've got all sorts of roving bands of raiders, and the Muslims are at the gates in Spain. All of that. People forget that the Muslims the Moors in fact made it to Tours in France. Like, it wasn't the Moorish advance was not stopping in southern Spain. There was a moment where Europe almost completely fell to Islam, because if the Franks hadn't stopped them in 732, if Charles Martel had not dropped the hammer, they might have taken all of France, even Germany, and then, if they had France, they had a land route into Italy. Like the Middle Ages could have gone completely differently if it weren't for, traditionally, a guy named Roland. Who was Roland? Roland was a knight. He was a very early knight. He was the leader of what was no longer quite a comitatus, but it was an organized group of soldiers fighting under one leader in the larger body of an entire army. Also, for your European and English followers, I would say Beowulf is what you want to look at in terms of comitatus. Beowulf led a comitatus. His group was a comitatus. And by the same token, Roland did the same thing. And the story I'm referencing is, of course, the Song of Roland, for those who don't know. But what his story is he's the head of the rear guard, and he gave the army of Charles Martel long enough to reconvene to, be prepared to fight, that they were able to defeat a Moorish attack as they retreated out of Spain. And what you see is that's kind of the first story of chivalry. This guy going into battle with pretty much the full awareness that he was going to die, as were most of his men. But the chivalrous thing to do was to sacrifice yourself for the greater good of your army, of your people. This was not uncommon in Rome either. The Romans also had a similar tradition of, self-sacrifice to, that was how you went into legend, was if you turned the battle around by gloriously leading your bodyguards into a charge against a weak point in the enemy line and turning the battle on its head. So it's kind of the same thing, but for different reasons. It's no longer about living on in glory. It's about doing the chivalrous thing, the knightly thing, the Christian thing to do is to die in service of the greater mission of eternal salvation. That was kind of what they were thinking here. But just because chivalry begins there doesn't mean it ends there. Obviously, it evolves. And when people think of chivalry today, they're thinking of, you should hold the door open for women, and you should, the men should always pay on the first date and stuff like that. They think of that as chivalrous. And there were parts of the Code of Chivalry that, and of course the Code of Chivalry varied from place to place, but the general idea of chivalry, there were parts that were about how you should treat other people and how you should, be kind to the elderly and to women and defend the weak and stand up to the strong, always be morally upright, stuff like that. But for the most part, chivalry was how you dealt with each other in combat, Yeah. It was, for every rule about helping an old lady cross the road, there was a rule about the logistics of how do you, capture a knight and sell them for a ransom.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the next evolution of it as you get into the high medieval period, out of the early Middle Ages, is that knights go from being just professional soldiers to a class of their own. And that's partially due to the feudal system, because the feudal system needed an intermediary group. It needed a warrior class below the lord to actually have any meaning whatsoever. Because if the lord commanded a peasant militia, a fyrd, as they might have done during the early medieval period, what was the lord actually doing? The peasants were defending themselves. He was just leading the army. No, they needed a class of professional warriors. And that is what these comitatus structures, these household guards, that's what they turned into, was professional warriors. And how do you sustain a professional warrior? You either have to pay them in currency, or you can give them land. So now you've got actually two different classes of knights. You've got your landed knights, and you've got your just professional paid knights. And of course, eventually that paid knight level actually kind of becomes more like men-at-arms, and almost all knights are landed by the end of the Middle Ages. So in that period where things are beginning to change, there's a very specific reason that it's changing as well. And that is that medieval combat made a significant shift from shield walls with archers behind them to mounted knights. And there is, obviously this is a gradual process, but there is kind of a flashpoint moment for it, which is that at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, you had the two army styles fighting face to face. The French or the Normans landed with mostly cavalry, That was the bulk of their army. That was their intention, was we're going to take these guys in chainmail. And of course, chainmail, everybody likes to wear their chainmail to a Renaissance fair or look at the movies, and the chainmail always goes down, at the very most, like midway down your thigh. No, they were wearing chainmail that actually hung down over their boots because they didn't intend to fight on foot. They intended to fight on horseback. And if they were on foot, they were probably going to surrender because they weren't going to be able to move very well. Now, later on, mail absolutely does change to allow knights to fight on foot. But the Normans were primarily either fighting for the French or fighting against other Norsemen. So they never really had a reason to worry about fighting on foot because they were always going to have more men and overpower everybody. And the only way you were ever going to end up in a situation where you were supposed to be fighting on foot was in defense of a castle or something like that. So at Hastings, you have the English shield wall with longbowmen behind it, which is the way the English fought wars. And then in front of, opposed to them, you had, crossbows and, some militia spears, and primarily your actual fighting force, those heavy cavalry, those mounted knights. And a lot of people, know about the Battle of Hastings. They know that King Harold was shot through the eye and that kind of ended the battle and all of that. They don't really know, most people are not aware that Hastings was not a single skirmish where the two battle lines met and the English king was killed and that was it. No, it was 3 battles. It was 3 skirmishes across the course of the day. The Normans actually lost the first 2. They won the third one. And they did not win. It was not an overpowering victory either. And it's not like they killed Harold and the English just totally gave up. The English actually formed up in a shield wall for the third time at the edge of a cliff, and then stepped aside when the horses got there. And you had a whole bunch of Norman knights who just went right over the cliff. So there's, it's not nearly the cut and dry battle it seems to be, but by the end of it, what is for certain, knights are a far more efficient single soldier than a guy with an axe and a shield wall. Yeah. Because one knight, first of all, if their horse is armored, that's already a ton of force that's being projected into an enemy battle line. And then following that, you've got a guy who's got a lance and then at least 1 sword, possibly 2 swords, and probably a mace, because he can carry all that because he's on a horse. Whereas your average infantryman is going to he's going to always carry a spear, almost exclusively. Almost every single infantryman who ever fought a battle in the Middle Ages started the battle with a spear. You had, it really was the upper class who were not carrying spears into battle as their primary weapon. But the primary weapon of your average infantryman was a spear, and then they might have a sword or an axe. They probably had a very, like a sax knife or something. But, you just one guy could only carry 1, maybe 2 weapons and a shield. A knight could carry 3, 4 weapons, a shield, possibly a backup shield, a quiver of arrows to, drop off if there's some reason to, javelins. They can carry all these different things. So a knight is a much more versatile and efficient single soldier, but it's also much more expensive. And so that's why there's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario here. Did the feudal system result from knights, or did knights result from the feudal system? Because the feudal system was absolutely beginning to rear its head, but knights, as we know them, might not have needed to be mounted. If they hadn't needed to be mounted, would we have seen the vast feudal estates that we saw? Possibly not, because we might have been looking at a very different situation where for the same amount of land that was required to feed and pay for 1 knight, you could feed and pay for 10 infantrymen. So would we have ever seen, these massive feudal estates? Not necessarily. You might have seen something much more similar to the early medieval period when you'd have, people leaving their farms to go fight in the Firth, or kings paying out of their coffers for somebody to fight for them, just mercenaries. Instead, because a knight on horseback, first of all, they're going to need a regular traveling horse. They're going to need at least 1 battle horse. They're probably going to need a horse for their squire. They might even have horses for pages. So there's all these different things that, a knight's going to be 20 times as expensive as your average infantryman. So you've got to have these large feudal estates. And, when a knight is being dressed in heavy chainmail, carrying at least 2 weapons, they're carrying a shield, they have to get on their horse. they're probably going to need help, and that's where squires come into it. And squires are kind of a cross between a servant and an apprentice, which I guess kind of is what apprentices are. And a lot of, an easy way to think about this is very much the Jedi Order from Star Wars, something very familiar to people, and it is point for point, the knight system of, but you're a Jedi Knight, you can be a Jedi Knight and also an apprentice at the same time. That's kind of correct. But, a youngling would be a page. Pages usually went into service around the age of 7. You did not have to be born into it. You could be born a commoner. You could be born a serf. And if your parents happen to be particularly wealthy serfs, which is a thing that existed, some people just chose to stay in the serf class and have lots of money. But usually what they would do with that money was send off one of their children, usually their eldest child, if they had multiple, but they would send off their eldest child to go and be a page. And then early in the teenage years, a page would be elevated to a squire around the time that puberty hit and they were growing into the body of a man. And then by the time you're reaching like 19, 20, 21, that's when you're probably getting knighted because you're fully grown. You've been training for 14 years. You're good to go. You're good to get out in the battlefield. And those guys, those knights that have had 14 years of training before they even are knighted, that's who you're thinking about. That's who you're looking at in movies like The King and in Braveheart. If you think about like the Battle of Bosworth Field and stuff like that, that's the knight that was there, which is a very, very far cry from the knights of the Beowulf era, where it's basically just a professional soldier. That professional soldier never left the battlefield over time. You still had professional soldiers who fought on foot with a spear and a sword and a shield in chainmail or gambesons or something like that. They were always around. They never left the battlefield, but they moved into a supporting role while that term of knight was elevated in stature in society. And eventually you came to knights who were, late medieval knights were as powerful as high medieval lords. They all had land. They all had their own soldiers. They had their own men-at-arms. They had their own squires. So it's kind of this evolution of going from a regular common soldier up to what would have been power beyond the wildest dreams of a knight from the 600s for a knight in the 500s. And of course, and the reasoning is that the knight was the most incredibly powerful weapon of war that had ever been seen at that point. This was essentially they were almost invincible. Because if you wanted to kill a knight, you had to, blunt force trauma to the head or find a chink in their armor. For the most part, knights didn't really die all that often. And the reason was because it was much easier to capture and ransom them than it was to kill them. To kill one, you'd have to get him off of his horse, rip his armor off, and hack at him. You didn't have time to do that in battle, and you got to assume that he's not able to get up and kill you, because if you're a common infantryman, you don't have that kind of armor or weapons training. You've got rudimentary training. You know how to use your sword and your spear, and you've got your armor on. A knight has been training since they were a literal child. Trains every day, several hours a day. These are people who their entire job was to wear 30-pound suits of armor and wave around 5 to 10-pound weapons all day. They were a lot stronger than you. If you were an average guy, these are people who would make modern American football players look wimpy. And if you go and you look at suits of armor from the late medieval period, they're big. Like these were big people and not fat people.
Layered as well, because you've got your gambesons, you've got your chain, and then you've got your plate. So it's so much to wear.
It would be so hard. Even with current weapons, it would be really hard for your average soldier to kill a knight, because there's I mean, if you think about what weapons are used today in the military, a knight wearing full plate armor, chainmail, and then leather or linen padding under it, that could stop a bullet. That could stop the ammunition that NATO uses probably would not pierce a knight's armor. At least not the first time. The concussive force would definitely suck, but it would not pierce it and kill you. It would definitely cause some bruising, But
Yeah.
that was one thing they used to do in the 1500s, 1600s, up into the 1700s before they finally began to abandon, armor, full plates of armor. By the 1800s, you've got cuirassiers who have, just their chests covered. But early in the Middle Ages, they would fire pistols, they would fire muskets, arquebuses at suits of armor to show that it could withstand it, because it could. And that's not a lot of people in the United States. I don't know how much your average British person knows about guns, but in the U.S. it's a lot more common. And even here, people don't understand how different the firepower is. They'll call it an AR-15, a high-powered rifle, but it's a .223 caliber that's about a quarter of an inch in diameter. Musket balls, the ones being used in the Revolutionary War, at least, were 60 caliber, which means they were 3 times as big and far less likely to pierce. It was probably going to be like a small cannonball ripping through your body. So the firearms of the time had to go a long way. If you think about that, they did not actually fully abandon the cuirass until like the early 1800s. That tells you exactly how effective these warriors were on the field of battle in the Middle Ages. There was nothing that could take down an armored knight easily. It was going to be a chore every single time, and that is why they fought each other. If you look at their equipment, the armor they were wearing, the weapons they were using, a knight going into battle against primarily a peasant force probably would bring a sword, a shield, their armor, that stuff. But a knight going into battle against other knights was probably going to bring along axes, maces, mauls, warhammers, so that they can actually get in there and cause the kind of trauma that is required to kill a man who is wearing 30 pounds of steel.
Yeah. It reminds me, like the way you're describing it, like I've recently been reading a book by Christian Cameron called The Ill-Made Knight, and it's about knights during the 100 Years' War with France. And there's a really good scene, a battle scene involving Geoffrey de Charny. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Because he was a really famous knight, wasn't he? And it showed his death. And there was about 8 people on top of him, like stabbing him through gaps and hacking away at him. Like, and that's what it takes. It's like trying to take down a walking tank, isn't it?
It's literally like, that's the comparison. They were the tanks of the Middle Ages. There's nothing you can do about it. The U.S. at least uses the M1 Abrams tank today. I think we lost 2 of them in Iraq. One of them got stuck in a ditch, and the other got stuck in the ditch trying to get the other one out of the ditch. There was the Battle of, I think it's like 73 Easton, I think is the name of the battle. 9 U.S. M1 Abrams tanks against like 40 Iraqi, well, they were Russian-built tanks, but 40 Iraqi tanks, and the U.S. did not lose a single tank in that battle. That's what we're looking at in terms of knights. Was like, one of my favorite examples is there's an episode, I can't remember any of the details other than this. There's an episode during the Crusades where a group of 50 Templar knights routs about 3,000 Saracen cavalry because they just could not find a way to kill these guys. They were used to fighting the Byzantines, who, had armor and professional armies, but not like this. And what they were finding was they're going into battle with thousands of them, and they can't even kill the horses. Like, because their bows were so weak. You're looking at like 30-pound draw weight bows. And these are knights whose armor is built to withstand crossbows and longbows, like, at the very least 60 pounds of force. So the weapons that the Saracens were using during the Crusades were half as powerful as they needed to be to have any effect against these guys. So the Crusaders very quickly figured out, we can just charge right at them. And there's nothing they can do about it because they can't pierce our armor. Yeah. It's the exact same thing as the modern NATO tank tactics. They can't pierce our armor, so we're just going to go right for them.
And this power, then, it's quite incredible, isn't it? That they're invincible. And one thing that became clear to me reading this book is that the power went to people's heads, and you got groups of knights. So they would just go around and just rape, pillage, take what they want, and no one can really stop them.
Yeah, that was part of the problem.
Yeah. So knights, obviously, they pretty much invincible, and there wasn't much to stop them from basically doing what they want. So I know there's a lot of, well, we've spoken a lot about chivalry, and there was a lot of books written about chivalry and the way knights should behave. The question I wanted to ask you is how many knights actually paid attention to this?
I mean, it would really depend. And I think, you kind of were hitting the nail on the head just a second ago, because the fact of the matter is, there was a structure to this. There was a hierarchy. The king, of course, had lords under him and knights under those lords, and those knights sometimes had knights under themselves. If your king was very hands-on and morally upright and, genuinely concerned about things, then he was probably going to pass that down onto the lords, and the lords would then pass that down onto the knights. But if you had a king who didn't care, there was going to be a lot less organization top down. And so when you had kings that did care and lords that didn't, they probably wouldn't like that. It's very difficult to operate on the diplomatic level with other countries when your knights are known for, raping and pillaging the countryside. That's not going to fly with other leaders.
Yeah.
So if you were a king, you wanted your knights to uphold chivalry if you cared about your reputation with other kingdoms. If you didn't care about that, then you probably weren't going to force them to uphold it as well, and you were going to get knights who didn't really care as much. But yeah, it was that kind of thing where I couldn't give you a number off the top of my head. But if a knight was fighting in a royal army, they were probably a bit more on the chivalrous side. If they were a hedge knight, they might care a lot less. And if you're looking at rogue groups of knights riding around and, pillaging and acting as bandits and all that, they obviously didn't care at all. But you also didn't see a ton of truly heavily trained knights that went outlaw. Most of the time, if a knight went the outlaw route, it was either because they were forced to, or some sort of disillusionment, or they got stranded somewhere, and they would probably collect a group of bandits and common criminals to help them out, and they might teach them how to behave like knights and pretend to be knights and would train them. But you're never going to have those people weren't going to be like true knights in terms of their training and their status.
Yeah.
So I'd say for the most part, the actual rules of war were followed pretty well, because when they aren't, it's a big deal in history. When we read documents and there's a time when a king or a knight or someone executes prisoners, it's a big deal. So by that we can infer that it was likely that people were, for the most part, following the majority of the rules that they were supposed to follow. And then, I think the best way to put this is, like, if you look at the Third Crusade, there's an episode where King Richard executes a whole bunch of hostages. He's like, I think, I'm trying to remember, I think it was that he was under siege and the Saracens were outside, and he said if the Saracens did not break and leave by 3 p.m., he would execute all of their hostages that he had within the city walls. And then the Saracens weren't gone at 3 p.m., so he executed them right outside under the walls. And it's like this big deal, because King Richard is, he's not a saint, but he's up there. He's a paragon of leadership. He's known as a virtuous man. And so for him to do that kind of shocks people. For this even to happen shocks people. And the fact that we're writing about it in the context of the Saracens, like these are people who to the Crusaders were the enemy. They did not consider them on the same level. These were Muslims. These were infidels. So the fact that it gets brought up like that leads me to believe that this was not a super common thing. We also get the story from Amalric, who is the bishop of, he's a French bishop. I think it's 1209 AD, if I remember the date correctly. The siege of, the massacre of Béziers. It is Amalric who is in charge. He was the abbot of Citeaux. He was a papal legate, Arnaud Amalric, and they conquered the city. This was during the Albigensian Crusade. And there's this moment where, and this is his letter to the Pope. He writes, "Indeed, because there is no strength, nor is there cunning against God. While discussions were still going on with the barons about the release of those in the city who were deemed to be Catholics, the servants and other persons of low rank and unarmed attacked the city without waiting for orders from their leaders. To our amazement, crying 'arms' to arms, within the space of 2 or 3 hours, they crossed the ditches and the walls, and Poitiers was taken. Our men spared no one, irrespective of rank, sex, or age, and put the sword to almost 20,000 people. After this great slaughter, the whole city was despoiled and burnt as divine vengeance miraculously raged against it."
Great.
Now, there's another account from Caesarius of Hesterbach, who writes, "When they discovered, from the admissions of some of them, that there were Catholics mingled with the heretics, they said to the abbot, 'Sir, what shall we do? For we cannot distinguish between faithful and heretics.' The abbot, like many others, was afraid that many, in fear of death, would pretend to be Catholics and after their departure would return to their heresy, and is said to have replied," I can't read this because it's Latin, but he is said to have replied, "Kill them all, God will know his own." This is not. This is another one of those instances where, like, every medievalist is going to know about that quote. Everyone who, like, this is what they do for a living is going to know about that quote.
Yeah.
There aren't that many quotes like that. So the fact that, like, when this does happen, it is a big deal, leads me to believe that, yeah, we're looking at a situation where, for the most part, people were in fact following the code of chivalry and not executing prisoners and not, pillaging and raping without any, any idea of right or wrong. That's very much a Victorian idea that was imposed onto the Middle Ages, was that medieval people were savages. In reality, you would be pillaging something now and then. There were basically two different kinds of war. I mean, there were a number of different kinds of war, but you had the two people kind of know best are wars of conquest, in which case you didn't want to pillage things, because then you were just left with a bunch of useless junk. And then there were wars like much of the 100 Years' War, where it was a war of attrition, because what you were trying to get was, you wanted, at the higher level, you had targets. You wanted, this county and this duchy to be part of your kingdom, part of England, and the French wanted to keep their stuff. The French wanted Aquitaine, and the English wanted to keep Aquitaine. And so you had these wars of attrition where you're going in and you are burning things and razing things and killing people and, not taking slaves, obviously, because that was illegal in medieval Europe. But in many ways, there's a lot of, just carnage and stuff. And the reason that happens is the kings at that level. King of England is saying, well, if you won't give me this stuff, I'm going to raise all of Normandy. And the French king is saying, well, if you don't leave Normandy alone, I'm going to raise all of Aquitaine. Because it's so high level for them that it doesn't matter. This is not, for the English, they didn't care about Normandy. They wanted Aquitaine. So they were fine raising Normandy and Burgundy. That didn't matter to them. Whereas for the French, they would be fine raising Aquitaine, but if the English conquered Normandy and they wanted it back, they wouldn't have gone in and destroyed everything. It would have been line battles where you're fighting against each other, which is kind of why I laugh when there's, raiding mechanics in video games today, because that's not how it worked. Like, you weren't raiding to cause slight economic discomfort. You were raiding to get a diplomatic solution. So a lot of video games, like the Total War series, if you raid someone's territory, it actually decreases their opinion of you and makes it harder to get what you want. It should decrease their opinion of you, but it should also put their feet to the fire, because that was the actual goal of a war like that, was cause so much pain and discomfort and suffering that the king has to capitulate.
Such a brutal time.
Oh yeah.
Well, it's so interesting because knights, when we think about chivalry and stuff like that, and we look at the reality, the contradictions are there, aren't they? And it's
100%.
It's a really interesting look at human nature, I suppose, isn't it? And I don't think anything's changed really. It's just different forms. Like when people have got this power, that sort of law of power and the things that they do to take what they wanted. It's amazing really how nothing's changed, but it's just the manner in which things are achieved.
The more things change, the more they stay the same,
Yeah. So it's fantastic. That was a fantastic insight to the development of knights and what it was like to be a knight. And I hope everyone out there listening has learned something new that you can use in your stories. Aidan, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. How can we find out a bit more about the Law Lodge and your own writing?
Yeah, so the Lore Lodge is just that. It's on YouTube, Patreon, and Instagram and Twitter. I'm expanding how many places you can find the Lore Lodge brand. You can also find me at the Aidan Mattis on most things. And yeah, in terms of my writing, the best place to get that is Patreon, which everything's accessible for $1 a month. And that comes with a bunch of short stories and serials and stuff like that I'm working on. And I'm trying to go full-time soon.
Nice.
So hopefully we'll be looking at a situation where I'm posting stories at least once a week, if not more, to that. But again, in order to get to that point, I do need the support.
Yeah,
please. But yeah, you can find me in all those places.
Yeah, please head over and check it out. It's like you say, Aidan, I think everyone appreciates how knowledgeable and professional as well. Like it is like speaking to like a professor at college sometimes. Like you know like so much.
That is the best compliment anyone has ever given me.
And I, from the feedback I've got, people really do appreciate everything that you share with us. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much.
No problem. We'll be back soon with more talk about medieval life and maybe even earlier, looking at sort of Roman and ancient Greeks as well, maybe in future episodes. But yeah, thank you very much, Aidan, and I will speak to everyone soon. Thank you, Aidan, once again for sharing all that wisdom. It's phenomenal how much you know about history, particularly medieval history. And everyone listening at home, I hope you've learned something new from Aidan's many lectures on all these different facets of life in the Middle Ages, which, as we all know, as fantasy lovers, that period of time plays such a big role when it comes to the settings of fantasy stories. And that basically, if we are going down that route, then all these episodes are designed to help with your world building in particular, and to give you ideas, inspiration, and knowledge, so that you can write with confidence and in compelling ways that your readers are going to absolutely love. We'll be back on the 28th of August with sociologist Dr. N. Beck, who is returning to the Toolshed to chat about sociology again, but this time we're sort of expanding upon what we discussed in the previous episode about the psychology of heroes and villains, and we're looking at the sociological considerations now behind those two characters in particular, but mostly villains. So it was absolutely fantastic chatting with N about this subject. So be sure to follow or subscribe if you don't want to miss it. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a quick rating on Spotify or a review on iTunes or whatever you listen to the show on. If you know of anyone you think may benefit from what we discussed, then please share it with them. And also a quick share on social media. It just helps us so much in getting the word out to a whole new audience. So if you want to support what we do, the share is the quickest and easiest way you can, and also one of the most significant ways that you can help us. Why not join our writing group? We meet on Discord and Facebook. And if you'd like to get involved, the links are in the description. You can also check out our Patreon page. I've recently uploaded a horde of world-building resources, including loads of guides and my writing class, which is usually about £25 to buy access to. And if you head over to Patreon, you can get access for a hell of a lot cheaper than that. And lastly, if you're interested in sponsoring an episode, if you're a publisher, a literary agency or editing service, or if you just want to tell us all about your new book and to get out there to some fantasy lovers, then get in touch on the Fantasy Writers Toolshed at gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening today. I hope you've learned something new. I like to say we're back on the 28th. And until then, keep on scribbling.